everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to our webinar. Today we're going to be talking about getting started in Storyline. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm an e-learning evangelist here at eLearning Brothers. This webinar will be recorded and we'll get a copy of it out to all those who are registered for the webinar, whether you attend or not. And we'll also post this on our website, on our blog later in the week. Today, to walk us through the getting started with Storyline, we have Adam Cannon, our Storyline evangelist, with us today. Thank you for joining us, Adam. We're super glad to have you with us, and there's a lot of excitement in our audience to learn more about Storyline today. If you guys have questions during the webinar, we'll be ready to answer your questions in the questions panel, or we'll try to bring those up during the webinar to Adam, so feel free to use that as you need it. We'll get to as many of them as we can. If we can't get to your question, we'll try our best to continue the conversation in the webinar recap. We've answered a lot of questions in those recaps that get posted on our blogs later. So if you think you have a question that didn't get answered, come back to that recap, see if we answered it there. Also, just so you know, one of the things that we like to do after the webinar is try to follow up as soon as possible. Sometimes it's just to get feedback. Most of the time we'd like to touch base and find out if anybody needs some one-on-one clarification about our webinar topics after the fact. And some of our webinars are very much about our templates, and we want to make sure that you're getting to see what you want of those templates, but especially if you're considering purchasing them. All right, so without any further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Adam.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Again, and welcome. I appreciate all of you taking time out to join us today for this webinar. I know that your holiday schedules are busy, and so I appreciate that. As Andrew talked about, we're going to talk about Storyline here, getting started with Storyline. And one of the caveats I want to say is, there's so much information that I could cover, even in an introductory course like this. And so I know that I'm not going to get to every topic perhaps that you hoped I would. There are lots of resources out there. I'm happy to answer those questions in the webinar recap, or later through email or whatnot. So please feel free to reach out, but also please feel free to ask them. And if I don't answer your question here live on the webinar, it's not because I don't I don't think it's valuable. It may just be a matter of time or relevance to the subject matter or whatever, but we will try to get to them all. So I want to start off with kind of gauging a feeling of where people are at. So if you could, maybe in the questions panel, give us an indication of kind of what your level of Storyline expertise is. Maybe if you're an instructional designer who's been doing e-learning for a while, but you're just moving to Storyline, you've been in Captivate or Lectora or some other tool, or you're brand new to the industry, or you just want to refresh your skill set or whatever. If you could post some of those answers in the questions panel, and then we'll let Andrew feed me a couple of those and see what's going on.
The majority of people are beginners or have absolutely no experience. Some people are new to the e-learning industry all around. There's a couple people that are on older versions of Storyline, so they're here to see if you're going to give tips or insight on the newer versions of Storyline. Lots of beginners, lots of absolute none. Somebody says that they saw us at DevLearn. Good to see you here too. We're glad you're coming over. Another person says that they're about to update to 360 and are interested in any sort of new information that you may give. So we've got a beginner to intermediate audience, I would say.
Great. And it's to those who are new to the industry or new to Storyline, I say welcome. To those who are looking for kind of up-to-date information, there will be a little bit of that in this, but there's another webinar that I did a month or two ago with Bill Milstead about some of the new features of Storyline 360 that cover specifically those new features in Storyline 3 and 360. That may be a good one to check out as well, because I'm not going to, because of the nature of this webinar, I'm not going to get into all the some of those more advanced features that we talked about in there. And so you might want to also check that out. Maybe while we're going, if you can track down.
I'll get that into the chat section. Yeah. We'll just check the little chat window and we'll get a link in there for you guys.
Yeah, so this, again, welcome. I love the e-learning industry. I love Storyline. I'm actually an evangelist for all three of the major tools, the Lectora, Storyline, and Captivate. I've used them all at varying degrees of proficiency with all of them. I'm more proficient in Storyline and Captivate than I am in Lectora, but I love it, and I love the what you can do with it. And so this is gonna be a walkthrough of Storyline, and I'm using 360 for this demo, but anyone who's been in Storyline for a while will tell you that a lot of the features and a lot of the interface really looks the same. There's been a few changes from version 1 to version 360, which is the latest version, but not a significant change in the look and feel and even the functionality. And so the concepts we're talking today are going to be across the board. And so let's go ahead and we'll look at that. And so some of the things we're going to look at today are what are slides, layers, master slides, triggers, animations, variables. These are kind of some of the basic things that you need to understand to look at Storyline, or to become familiar with Storyline. And right now, this slideshow that I'm running is actually, I created it in Storyline. So we'll jump out of this preview and we'll talk you through some of this stuff. So here I am in the Storyline interface. And when you first open Storyline, you see what we call the story view. Now you can see across my tabs across the top here that I have 2 other slides open, but I have the story view here. And this shows me, this is broken down into scenes. So this is a scene here called Untitled Scene. If I wanted to add a new scene, I could go add that. I can go rename the scene. So I could, call this, if I wanted to call it, a quiz, I could do that. And the way the scenes are numbered is just based on the order that they were added. It does not really on the order that they run. You can run any scene first. This is your starting scene is designated by this red flag. So if I wanted to come in here and make this the starting scene, I could do that. And you see it doesn't change the number of the scene because it was the second scene that I added, but I can make it my starting scene. And so it's just that little red flag at the top tells me what's my starting scene. And again, some people get kind of hung up on, well, this says scene 1 and this says scene 2, so they're going to run in that order. No, that's just the order you added them in. I'll sometimes have it start with scene 5 because I'll start by the first scene I will add will be my quiz, and then it'll be labeled scene 1. And so, don't get hung up on that. But so it's broken down into scenes and stories, or scenes and then slides, and the whole thing is under a story, one single story. And so in Storyline, there are the 3 basic windows. There's your workspace window here, which is where this story view is right now. And then there's a triggers and the slide properties windows over here on the right. And let's jump in really quick. We'll jump right into the slide, and you can see there's also, as with a lot of tools, there's a timeline down here where objects will go on the timeline, and we'll show you that as we go through. Up across the top, Storyline is designed to be very similar in nature to the Microsoft Office suite, particularly the PowerPoint, in terms of this ribbon up here that you have to work with. You have your basic tabs, your home, insert, slides, so forth. You go to the design. For instance, this is where I can see all sorts of different designs. That would be my whole story. This is where I can change my story size from 4:3 to 16:9 to some custom size. So all of that. So you can see that there's all these different tabs up here that I can go to, and each tab will pull up a different set of ribbon tools that you can use. And sometimes, being on an object, when I come in and go to an object, you'll also see some specialized tabs appear, these picture tools, that now I can go in and do some stuff to the picture. Or if I went in here, there's drawing tools. So you can see that this ribbon and these tabs will adjust based on what you're working with at the time. And so that's kind of a general overview of what's up here. Again, this is most of the stuff that you're going to see, in any type of, any type of interface like this. You've got your insert button that inserts all your different objects, your pictures, your shapes, caption, so forth. Some of the differences that you will see in 360 versus other versions of Storyline are found right here in this section called Content Library. With Storyline 360, I have access to a full range of characters and images and icons and things like that that I don't have in the other versions of Storyline without doing a specialized installation pack or whatever. So I've got all these characters that I can access and different photos and illustrations and whatnot. So that content library section is not going to be in versions 1, 2, or 3 of Storyline or in Presenter, except in Presenter 360. But the rest of these will be pretty much the same. Your pictures, shapes, so forth. And so those are the kind of things you can add in. So now as you're looking at this, I've got my main slide open right here. And you can see that it's over here on the right. It's got this is called my base layer. Because it's called a base layer because, like in some of the image editing tools, Photoshop, Illustrator, whatever, I can layer things on top of one another. In fact, if we come and look at this slide, for instance, you can see I have my base layer that's called Choices, and then I have 3 additional layers that come in on top that are then, as we run that, we would see that each of those is called by a click on a button. And it takes you to one of these layers. And so my base layer is where I work. This is where I do most of my stuff. But this is not the same as a master slide. One thing to think about when you're doing master slides, and again, if I'm going really fast, I apologize. I've told Andrew he can jump in at any time for questions, and so I want to make sure that I'm covering what I need to cover, but also that I'm not going too fast for you.
We're doing just fine now, Adam.
Okay.
We've got a few questions that we'll take further down the line. They're more general questions, but no questions now.
Good. So one thing to know about Storyline is there are 2 different kinds of slide masters. There's what we call a slide master, which is probably what you're used to if you've used PowerPoint or other tools similar to Storyline. There's also a feedback master. So your slide master is just that. It's the master slide for your slide, and within each slide master you have the top level master, which is where a lot of the look and feel is controlled, and then you have underneath that you have layouts. So in this layout, this one's called a title and content, and it's just on the blank slide. For the design I'm using, the template I'm using, there's just really one master and one layout. But if I wanted to create more layouts, I could do that. I can go in and create multiple layouts. And this is where I can go in and insert placeholders. If I'm on the master slide, on the first blank slide of the layout, and I want to, let me make a copy of this so that we can do multiples here. So I'm going to, on this one, I'm going to say insert a placeholder that is a text placeholder. I'm going to put that in there. I can go in and I can format that however I want. I could give it a formatting of kind of this orange. I can tell it what text to, what font to use. If I want it to be Lotto, if I want it to be a little bigger, this is where I do that. And then that becomes a placeholder now. And I can call that layout, if I wanted to just say title slide. And one of the nice things here is I can go over, and when I hover over my layout, you can see this blank layout here. When I hover over it, I am told it's used by 5 slides, whereas this one is used by none. And so then I can see, is that okay to delete? What's going to be affected by this, so forth. And so that's a good use of master slides. And that's in the slide master. Now let's look at the feedback master. The feedback master is just what it sounds like, really. It's a set of pre-designed slides that give you some feedback options here. They're pretty plain, but you can go in and create your own feedback master. And one thing to note is that the layers, you see here, we've got 2-choice feedback and 3-choice feedback. These are what the layers use. So when I'm back here at my at my slide and I see these two layers, option 1 and option 2, those layers are actually pulling in when I go to my layout. They're pulling in my feedback. You see that these are all my feedback master slides. So that's a good thing to remember in Storyline is you have two different types of master slides. You have your slide master, which is what's used for your base layer and most of your slides, and then you have your feedback master, which is used in quizzes and also in your layers here. And just a quick let's jump over here and we'll talk about layers real fast so that you understand what those are. So a layer really is just kind of a slide on top of a slide, and you can stack as many layers as you want. I could do this and accomplish the same thing this way by pulling each of these layers out into another slide and having it go that way. But the nice thing about a layer is it kind of layers it on top, so I can see this and sort of see some of the slide behind. So if I have a navigation bar that sits on my main layer, I can see that. So there's slides and then there's layers, and in terms of what you can put on them, they're pretty much identical in how they function and what you can do with them. There are a few things that you can't do with a layer, like I can't call a light box from a layer. I have to call a light box from a slide, and a light box is something a little different that I'll go into here as a little bit later in this presentation. But just understand that slides and layers are essentially the same thing, just with different names, and sort of they function differently in terms of layers on top of a base slide or a base layer, so that you can have multiple layers there, and you're calling multiple layers, and that navigation panel and any audio or whatever could run underneath all those layers. But the big difference is that the slides and layers use different master slides.
I've got a question here about layers,
Great.
Adam.
Great. Fire away.
The layer that you're showing right now on the screen, is the cutout character its own layer and the background is its own layer, or are layers different from that?
So if I were to go in, let me see if I can do this. So each thing on here, so I'm on option 1 layer, and you can see that all of these items on the timeline, from the top down to where I see this base layer entry on the timeline, those are all on this one layer, this option 1 layer. So the cutout person, this text box here, this text box here. Some of these, this white box, for instance, are actually back on the feedback master. So I can't change that. That's why I don't see the white box there. So I can see that content, I can see the title content, I can see the people cut up, and I can see the continue button. And so those 4 items are on my layer. And then on the base layer, I have some options as well where, I can't see them because they're hidden right now, because I've got those hide objects on the base layer and because I'm not selected there. But when I come back here, and so let me show you how that would look. Let me just do a quick insert of a slide so that you can see a little bit better how that works. And let me just I'll just insert a completely blank slide, and I will make the base layer, we'll make it kind of a blue. And then when I go in and if I add a layer, now I'm on a layer here. You can see I've got that selected. And so I can, if I go in on the layer now and I format the background and make it kind of an ugly yellow, then you can see that when I'm on the slide, it's blue, and when I'm on the layer, it's yellow, and then I can insert, I could insert a photo really fast if I wanted to say, if I said a chair, and I came in and I said I want to insert this chair, put it on the base layer, maybe I want to insert a character.
Can you show us how you added a layer again?
I sure will. So let me go back and do that. So right down here at the bottom, there is a new layer button on the bottom right. Or I can also, from the ribbon, I can do insert slide layer. And by default, it picks up the background of the base layer until I go in and do a change. And so at any time I can go in and I can either using this little new layer button down here on the slide layers panel, or up here on the ribbon on the insert tab, I've got the slide layer. The other thing to realize is that any of these panels on the right can be undocked. I can take them off and move them around so that they are somewhere else. I can resize them. I could move them to another monitor if I have another monitor, you know, things like that. And then I can redock it just by clicking on this, and then it redocks it over there.
There's another question here. When would you recommend using slides versus a new layer?
So my general rule of thumb is if you're going to do a slide, like for instance, we'll look at this one. We've got a slide here. If I were to put a navigation panel on the bottom here, and I wanted that navigation panel to always be visible and clickable, then I could put layers on top of that. I also like to do layers to sort of keep a concept together. So again, here I've got my three choices. I could very easily craft out these options into 3 different slides, but then it's a little harder for me to keep track of which slides go with which, you know, with which choice. Whereas this way, I can just say from here, I'm going on to the layers. It's really good to keep concepts like this in a single slide, because then your navigation doesn't get all confusing as you're saying. Because if I go through each of these layers on the navigation, I'm still on this slide. So a forward or next button will still take me, if I go forward from this slide and then come back, it will take me back to this slide rather than back to whatever slide I last visited if I were breaking my layers out into slides. And so I generally say, as a rule of thumb, I try to keep concepts on layer, you know, in a single slide and layer them where I can, rather than and then break out sort of each slide into a new concept or a new subject to go from that. And then of course within that I can do scenes that go even bigger. So if I've got kind of a whole concept within the course that I'm teaching, I'll put that into a separate scene. You know, so if you kind of think in terms of little chunks of information, that's kind of a long-winded answer to a short question, I guess, but I hope that gives some explanation.
Okay, and we'll take more questions further down. Okay.
So again, as you can see, I've got, you know, several layers here, and each time I put something on a layer, so on this layer I see my one picture here. If I wanted to go in and put in my character that I downloaded, you know, if I go to my Illustrated, I've got her and I want to insert her, then she shows up on my timeline. But when I go to my base layer, she's not on the timeline. She's just on this layer, and she's not on layer 2 either. And so if I were to preview, you know, this slide, first of all, I wouldn't see anything because I don't show the layers unless I'm told to show the layers. And that's kind of the next concept we'll get into, which is up here in the triggers. But that's how you add a layer. I can duplicate, copy a layer. If I wanted to duplicate this layer again, I just click that duplicate select layer icon down there that's got the two documents with a check mark on it, and now it gives me a new one, and it's called a copy. And if I want to rename it, I just go in and I can just rename that layer to layer 3. I can lock the visibility to where I say, you know, show this or don't show this. That's the same thing I'm doing here, where I hide other slide layers, things like that. So, you know, and then if I want to delete the layer, it's as simple as just clicking on the little trash can icon there to delete that layer. Comes up with a question, yes, I want to delete it. Now I'm back to just my 2 layers that I had. Okay, and again, I apologize for the color scheme. This is just a quick, you know, a quick hit demonstration of how to do this. So we've gone over slides and layers and master slides. So we're going to take a look now at kind of how this looks in concept, so that you can see it work. So we'll look at this slide really fast on preview mode. And so I'm in here. I've got my slide going, and I've got two choices here. And you can see as I hover over them, they change, and we'll talk about that in a minute. When I click on one, now I see this new layer. I'm still on the main slide, but it just shows me that layer. I can continue, and that would take me to the next slide. Okay, just because that's what that continue button's doing. But it's very, very basic in terms of what it does. There was also some audio out there. I don't think you could hear the audio playing because it was just playing on my system. But you can see that these little audio icons out here tell you that there's both a click sound and, as I scroll down, there's a click sound and an intro piece of music that's playing. One of the nice things is, like with most things that run on a timeline, is I can lock my timelines to where I can't now select this accidentally. So if I wanted to lock down this cutout character so I didn't accidentally select her when I was trying to do something else, I can lock her down. Now I can come over right here, and select a button, and it, then when if I were to go to grab this edge and move it, I wouldn't accidentally select that lady cutout character there. So that's a good thing. I can also hide it if I want to not show it for a minute and do some stuff on the background. So I just click that eyeball icon, or I can hide everything on the layer or lock everything on the layer. So that kind of goes over layers and slides and the master slides and layouts and so forth. So understand that. Next up, we're going to talk about what triggers are. And you see over here on the right, there's a trigger panel. And right now, when I insert a new slide, there are just two triggers that come in, and those are your player triggers, which are just your built-in navigation buttons. So it's a next button and a previous button, and it also has, if I'm doing mobile, because Articulate 360 is mobile enabled or responsive, I also have a swipe left and right that will enable that as well. So it shows when the user clicks the next button or swipes next. If I wanted to get rid of those because I want to create my own navigation buttons, I just uncheck these, and those will go away. And so now I've got a blank slate here for my slide. If I came in and I inserted, if I wanted to go in and insert a button, for instance, I wanted to put in a button here, and I could choose whatever format I wanted. I could have an arrow if I wanted on it. I can check an action when clicked, what's going to happen, or I can come over here and I can click this add trigger. I can even do this add trigger button here, add a new trigger. But what this is a trigger is just, it's a command essentially that tells what to happen, kind of an if-then statement. So right now I'm going to say I want my action to be jump to slide, whatever slide that is, and I can drop down and I can select whatever slide that is. When the user clicks, which object are they clicking? So the action, what's the object of that action in terms of what's taking that action? And then when something happens, when something happens, there's a lot of things here. It can be a user clicks, a double click, right click, a click outside. So if I wanted to say everything except this button is clickable, I can even do it when a mouse hovers over something. I can do it on a state change, or when objects intersect on motion paths, or enter slide, leave slide. So there's a whole bunch of things here. And then there's these timeline events, which are when the timeline starts. That means if I click that and I say, when timeline starts on, so that's saying this timeline down here at the bottom, I can see that button starts at the beginning of the timeline of the slide. This is again on the master slide, or on the main layer, the base layer. So when the timeline starts on this slide, it would jump to whatever slide. I don't know why I would want to do that necessarily for a slide, but one thing you could do is you could do that on a layer. If I had a layer here that I wanted to just come in and I didn't want anyone to do anything on the master slide except just have this navigation button here, I could have it jump immediately. So I could go in and I could say, show layer 1 when timeline starts on this layer. And then as I do that, and if I go into my visibility properties, oh, let's go in here, and I say I don't want to hide the objects on the base layer. I don't want to prevent them from clicking on the base layer. If I go back to my base layer and make sure that that button is visible, and then just to show, we'll put a shape on this. And so now if I go in and if I preview this slide, so you see it comes right in, it shows that layer right away, but I can still click on this button. And so that's an example of using the timeline trigger to jump right to a layer. Again, I wouldn't necessarily want to jump right to another slide when one slide starts, but I certainly could use it to jump to a layer. So there are a whole bunch of actions that you can do here, and there's a whole bunch of when statements, when certain things happen, and those are grouped into events. So a drag and drop event, a timeline event, a control event. These are good for if a user presses a key, you can have them press the enter key to continue so that you could put in a software simulation, things like that, or when the audio completes or a video completes or control loses focus, things like that. So there's a lot of things you can do with triggers there. And you can even add in some conditions. So, if I wanted to say if something, then, if something has to happen first, then I can add that as a condition. And that's a little bit more advanced than where we're going to get to for this, but just understand that you do have those conditions. I can also, as with anything, I can duplicate a trigger, or I can copy and paste it, so I can just click the copy and then paste it down, and there it is again. If I want to get rid of it, I delete it. One thing to note, if I have a whole bunch of triggers in here, if I come into this slide and I see a whole bunch of triggers in here, they're going to read in the order that they are listed here. And so that's why I have these up and down buttons. I can move them up or down within each of these objects. So these are the triggers for button 1 and within them. So the first thing it's going to do is show layer option 1, and then it's going, but they happen so fast that you don't always know. But just understand that sometimes if you had it say, I don't know, what a good example is, start playing the audio or start playing the video and then jump here, sometimes that can interfere. And so understand that those triggers run in the order that they're listed there. And even though that order can parse faster than we can read it, it can cause some hang-ups sometimes if you've got one thing that would override something else that happens second. So make sure that you keep an eye out for that. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and see if there's any questions on what I've covered.
There are a lot of questions here, Adam, and we'll get to as many of these as we can. Really quickly, can you explain once more what a trigger is?
Okay, a trigger is like a command. If you think of it as, I want something to happen when something is done. So if I look at this structure, I say, okay, what is the action I want to happen? In this case, I said I wanted it to show a certain layer, and then that layer takes an object. What layer do I want to show? And then what's the action that's happening, or what's causing that trigger to fire? So that's saying when the user clicks, and the object of that click is button 1. So it's kind of that cause and effect statement of the, and it's just written a little backwards. The effect is that it will show whatever specified layer, and the cause is the click of button 1. And so that's essentially what a trigger is. It's a cause and effect, and then you can put some conditions on it if you need to say check this before you run the effect.
There's a couple questions about how do you add a click sound? How do you add sounds to clicks?
Okay, so in this case, we've just gone in and we've put, it's just an audio clip that we've just gone and grabbed that click sound. And so you can see, and then it's just a play media. So I can, on this button, you can see play media click sound. So it's just one of the triggers here. It's just play the media, and the media is there. It's on the timeline. Click sound when the user clicks button 3. Okay, if I go in and insert a button, for instance, I can do that same thing here. I can, play media if there was media here, and I could just record, or I could do it from a file or whatever. So that's just a simple, we just grab the sound. If you're doing a screen recording, like a screen capture where you're recording a software demonstration, it will capture some of those for you, and you'll have a little bit more functionality than if you're just trying to create it yourself.
Another question here is, once you click a trigger, does that option gray out, or can you set it up so that option grays out?
Yes, and that's going to be this right here next to the word timeline is the states. And so I'll show you that here in just a second, and we'll talk about that. But really quickly, if I click on this button and I go into states, I can see that there's a couple of built-in states. And I could actually add more, so I could have it be, I could add a state that was a selected state or a disabled state. And then that could be, I can go in and I can change that, for instance, really quickly to just be grayed out. So that would be, and then whatever trigger I would say would just be change the state of this when this happens if I didn't do that. But we'll go over those states more in a minute, but in essence, yes, you can have it do that.
Okay, one more question that we'll take right now. Can you delay your timeline from starting?
Yes. So you see on this slide how all of these are not flush up against this starting the 0 mark. By just grabbing those, if I come back to the slide here where I've inserted something, if I wanted this picture to start later, I can have it come in. The slide timeline starts, but nothing on the slide will appear until it hits that timeline. And of course, I could always put some kind of pause in there. I could say, whatever action, I can say pause timeline of this layer until, when the timeline starts on this layer for whatever reason. So I could pause it until such time as a user clicks. So hopefully that made sense what I just said. But yes, you can pause the timeline. You can also delay the objects on the timeline or on the slide or layer from coming in just by sliding them on your timeline here by grabbing the front edge when I get that double-sided arrow and sliding that around. I can also have them disappear the same way. Okay. Any other questions?
There's lots more questions, but let's move forward.
All right. So we're going to move. I'm going to go back to this blank slide over here. And so I've got this button put in, and I'm going to go in and format it so it's a little easier to see. So we'll make it orange. But you can see right now that I've got it showing an untitled layer when the user clicks on it. But the next thing to think about there are states. And a state is just different versions of that same object. You can see as I hover over them, the button changes slightly for each one. There are several built-in states, normal, hovered, down, visited, disabled. I can also create whatever state I want. So if I go in and I say, I want to add a new state to this button, and I want to say, you know, mouse 2, and I create that state, and then I want that one to be blue, and maybe I also want there to be, instead of that arrow on it, I want there to be, you know, maybe a bigger arrow like that. And I want to change it, and then maybe I also want to insert a character here. So I can go in and I can say, you know, I want to put her in. And so I can insert her just on this state. So she only appears when it changes to this state. And so I've got that now that done. Mouse 2, maybe I want to also insert at the same time, I want to insert a caption so she's saying something. And then I'm done editing my states, and now on my main slide layer, I can say over here when, you know, maybe I'll just do a quick add the trigger here to change state of button 1 to state mouse 2 when user clicks button 1. And so now if I preview that, you can see that she's not here on the state, but when I click that, there she appears. And because this is on the base layer, you can see it. And it's already changed that state now but it still keeps my hover state, but it changed it to blue. And she's there. I just did it on the, you know, if I got rid of this layer or got rid of this trigger that starts this layer, then we can see it happen better. So if I preview that now. So I see that the button's orange and it's got this arrow with a little tail on it, and she's not here. As soon as I click it, this is now a state. So you can do stuff on states that are very similar again to layers, where maybe I just want it to be something that happens when I hover. Maybe I only want this caption to appear when I hover over the button so that it gives me a hint. And so I can create states like that. And so that's one of the things I can do is I've gone in, and you notice that she's not even on the timeline. So if I go back here to the timeline, the only thing on the timeline is a button. But when I go into the states of that button, that's where I can see this mouse 2 state. The other thing to think about with the states is I can tell it whatever state I want to be my starting state. And so if I don't want to see that button, I can create my starting state as a hidden state, and then I come into my trigger and I say change the state of button 1 to normal, and I can say when the timeline reaches, let's say, we'll say 3 seconds. So I'll change that to 3 seconds. And so then we come in and we preview it. And we see the button's not there, and we go 1, 2, 3, and there it appears. So the button comes in at 3 seconds because I told it to come in as with the trigger to change the state. And so again, but even though it's here, you know, that's just when my initial state is hidden. So anytime you insert something, it can become, you can change the state. Now there's a lot of things that when I insert them, a button automatically comes in with built-in states. If I just went in and inserted a shape because I wanted to create my own button, you see it just has one state. It just has the normal state. But the great thing is I can still make this a button by adding a trigger to it. I can make it a button by adding a state. I can go in here and I can click New State, and I can drop down and select one of my other states, hover, add that in. Now I can just, with the format, I can say I want this to go to this when it's formatted. And so then as I roll over it, I can see that it changes states when I'm hovering. So, and there's a lot of things you can do with states right there. The one thing you can't do on a state, you can't put a group on a state. You can't, like if I've got 2 objects on this state, if I'm in my state here, I can't go, I can't copy a group from one thing and put it onto a state. I have to copy all the objects and put them on a state. But that's down the road too, and a little more advanced as we get into it. So that's a quick introduction to states. Anything you put on a slide can have a state if it's on the timeline, and anything you put on the slide can take a trigger. So the storyline is pretty powerful in terms of that. Some of the other e-learning tools out there, you're very limited in what you can create as a button or a clickable item or whatever. And so understand that. If I wanted to, I could still also make something a button by inserting a hotspot. And that's useful if I've got a transparent object, if I wanted to make this shape so that there was no fill. If I do a no fill, then the clickable area just becomes this outer edge. But if I wanted to still make it clickable, then I could insert a hotspot on it that was the same size. And then that whole area becomes clickable. And again, you see the hotspot automatically knows it's going to want to trigger, and so it's going to take me to that trigger. So let me pause now for a few more, see if there's a few more questions.
Yes, Adam, can you give an example of a scenario where it's better to use a state versus a layer for interactivity?
Sure. Like I talked about, if I've got this button and I wanted to show, let me just, if I had a template ready, there's a template where we've got 3 people that are standing there, and you hover over them to hear what they say. Like I could create her in a state where when I hovered over her, she might say something. And I can't necessarily do that to jump to a layer when I hover over something, but I can change a state to hover over something. I also can do a state if I want it to just be, if I don't want to clutter up my timeline, if I just want to do it on buttons. Really, there's no hard, fast rule of when to use a slide, when to use a layer, when to use a state. It's kind of up to each individual developer to understand what they are and the power and the uses for them, or the functionality that you've got with them, and then to kind of make their own decision based on the way they go. And what I generally recommend is look at what's out there. Look at the templates that we've got on our website. Look at the Articulate forums on the Articulate site. There's a lot of the eLearning Heroes challenges that they do every week. Download some of those project files and start to deconstruct them a little bit and look at how they're done and try to figure out why did they use a state here versus using a layer or a slide or something else. And really there's a 4th one that you can use called a light box, which is just adds to the confusion a little more. But there's, in honesty, there's not really a hard, fast rule of when to use one or the other. I can do just about anything in Storyline using only slides, never using layers, never using states, things like that. I can do it all just using slides and objects. It just gets a lot more convoluted in terms of trying to keep track of things. And so if I'm going to use this same character on multiple slides and I want her to have those same states throughout, I can create it as a state. And when I copy and paste her, those states go with her. So that's a good option for using states too. But I hope that helped answer the question.
Here's 2 more questions that are fairly similar. One says, I tried to copy a custom state from one button to another, and it didn't work. Can this be done at all, or do you have to create a new state for each button? And then another question that's similar. Would you use triggers to set up your navigation bar for every scene, or is there a way to save it for future use? So these are both speaking to, is there a way to create, so to speak, a template inside of your project that you can move for your navigation or for your buttons or custom states?
So to answer the second question first, if I go into my master slides, I can go in here, and if I choose this, where is it? Oh, I can preserve it. And so that means that anytime I move this if I've got this master slide, I can preserve it so that it's attached with this slideshow, and I can use that master. So then I can, if I copy this slide over to another presentation, it takes the master slide with it. And I can see that by the little push pin right there if I get rid of it. So you can create your navigation buttons right on your master slide, and then have them do some stuff. In fact, a lot of the eLearning Brothers templates, we've done that. We've created a navigation bar on the master slide. The only thing you want to be careful about is if you start to customize your next and back buttons, if you want them to go to the last slide visited versus the last slide in the sequence, those might be two different things, because you might do a branching scenario where you're going to take them down a path, but the last slide visited might just be the last slide in that path versus the slide where you got sent down that path from. And so if you're going to do that, you can't do that on a master slide, but you can still create the button and then create the trigger on the slide layer itself where it happens. As far as copying and pasting within the states, let me just close this out here, and we'll go back to this button. And if I said I'm in the states and I've got this custom state, I can duplicate it, but I can't copy and paste it. And so, so really I just need to recreate. But what I can do is I can create that button. So if I'm on this button here and I've got this state, if I just copy that button again or duplicate that button, then I can go in here and I could edit the states on that one now and get rid of everything except the one state I want. And then I can kind of start from there, and then I could so then I've got this second one that's kind of a duplicate of this. And so that's one kind of a roundabout way, a little bit of copying and pasting a custom state, is to just copy the object and then remove whatever states you don't need, or adjust the other states.
Okay. Another question here is, when does one use presenter? Typically, you're going to be exporting these courses for use elsewhere. So when do you use presenter?
Are you talking? I assume they're talking about the Articulate tool called Articulate Presenter. If that's the case, if you've got Storyline, there's not a lot of reason to use Presenter. Presenter is a PowerPoint plugin, essentially, that gives you some e-learning tools to spice up your PowerPoint. It's kind of the predecessors to what you can do with Storyline. So if you've got a bunch of PowerPoint slide decks and you're just trying to convert them into e-learning, you can take them. You can use a presenter to help you do that. If that's what you're talking about. If not, then clarify in the questions panel if there's something else you mean by when you say presenter.
There's one last question. We're running out of time here, so I'll just take this one last question. Why is extra navigation added or needed when it already exists automatically at the bottom of your finished product?
Okay, it's not needed, but sometimes it's wanted. Sometimes I want my navigation buttons to look a certain way or to be a certain spot on the slide. If I go in and I've got my slide that has the navigation buttons built in, when I preview that slide, you can see that they are right here at the bottom. I don't have a lot of customization I can do to them, and I can't move them. And so if I go in and I say, I'd rather have it be my own look and feel, I like the cleanness, I don't want to see that frame around the slide or whatever, I want to create my own, that I can control what they look like, what they feel like, and I can have for instance, a style guide that dictates what they look like. I can do that. Maybe I want it to be my company logo that's a navigation button, or a certain icon set that we use. And so it's not that they're needed, It's just that for a lot of developers, they prefer to create their own navigation buttons rather than use the built-in ones by default. But no, you can again do a whole storyline project just using those default buttons if that's all you want to do. And you can even change what they do. I mean, I can, just like here, I can change what slide they go to. You know, they're just still a trigger. I can just edit that trigger and say, do whatever I want it to do. And then I would go into the player properties and change that. So there are a couple things I didn't touch on just because we ran out of time. But one of them is animations. Animations are pretty basic, like in PowerPoint. PowerPoint has a few more animations in that they have emphasis animations. Here we have entrance, exit, and then motion paths. And so a motion path, I could go in on the car and say, I want this motion path, and I want it to be to the right, and I want to grab this little button here and stretch it out, and it shows me where it's going to end. I want to do the duration, and then I can just say move it when it starts or when something happens or whatever. So again, a motion path can have that. And you can see one of the nice features about Articulate 360 is I can now name this motion path. So if I wanted to go in and say, you know, call this car moves to the left or car to the right, I can do that. And then when I'm looking at my triggers, I know what motion path it's using. So that's a quick summary of animations. Again, those are pretty simple. And then variables are a little more complicated. A variable is essentially just what it sounds like. It's a way of sort of using that if-then statement. If something happens, and there's a whole lot of information out there, and variables really should be their own webinar, and I'll probably do one of those down the road, kind of a follow-up to this one on variables and some of the other things that you can do. Again, there's a lot of information here, and a lot that I could have covered that I didn't, these design tabs and the transitions and so forth. The best thing I can suggest to you is go ahead and open Storyline, find some templates or find some projects that are done already that you can get a hold of the project files, excuse me, and start to play with them, start to deconstruct them, and start to ask the questions of why you're doing certain things. Like I've said, if you need to reach out to me, we have methods where you can do that, where you can reach out and I can help walk you through. In fact, one of the offerings that we have is a one-on-one mentoring session where you can purchase a bank of credits, I guess, of 1 hour sessions where you can sit down with one of our experts at eLearning Brothers and sit down with your project. They share your screen, they can get control, you can take control, whichever, and they can talk you through how to do what it is you need to do. And in Storyline, in most cases, that's me that will be talking you through it. But I've done that for several people where they just sit down for an hour. They say, I want to figure out how to add this button and make it do this. And so we talk them through it. Sometimes I'll do it and then I'll let them do it, and we'll talk about how they do it. But it's a really nice feature that you can get, and I believe Andrew's going to stick a link to that in the email that goes out here later today. But let me just, in the last minute or so, Andrew, any other pressing questions I need to answer?
Yeah, you mentioned that there are templates for Storyline. Where can those be accessed?
So, eLearning Brothers site, we have a whole bunch of templates. If you have Storyline 360, there are also up here in the slides in the content library. There are a whole bunch of templates out here that you can grab that are kind of pre-built stuff that give you kind of some. There are types of slides, openings, whatever, or you can do the whole thing and see the whole set and they're under different categories: Inspire and Velocity and Vision and whatever, and you can see all those out on the content library site as well. So those are some places that you can get them. Also on the Articulate forums, a lot of times people will share templates that they've created or share projects that they've created, either as part of the e-learning challenges or as part of a resolution to a solution to a problem, or just out of the goodness of their heart, they'll share them and you can download them and play with them. And that's actually how I got a lot of my storyline knowledge was just by taking those and really sort of working backwards, saying, okay, if I pull this out, what happens? If I pull that out, what happens? Okay? Anything else? Any other pressing questions?
There's a lot of questions left, and Adam, I'm going to go ahead and just take a screen grab of these questions and send them over to you. If you guys want to see these questions answered, if you didn't get your question answered, check out the blog later in the week that will go over more of what Adam talked about today. As you can see on the screen, you can schedule a free demo to look at some of the other storyline templates that are in our library. I'll also send you a link in an email within the next few hours that will have some of the free templates. In fact, one of the template that Adam had on his screen that he was working with, that's one of the free templates you can get in our free library. So be sure to check that out. That link will go out there. If you're interested in one-on-one mentoring or anything else, call the number on your screen, 801-796-2767. Thank you so much, Adam, for this great webinar. We've got a lot of positive feedback, a lot of people very excited about Storyline and found this information useful. So thanks for joining us. And thanks, everybody, for joining our webinar. We hope you have a great day. See you later.